Today, I am going to discuss the topic of population and sampling. Population and sampling are more important to the researcher when going to do a research project. Population and sampling are two terms usually familiar to all because these terms were used frequently in your studies during the last several years. There are mainly two learning outcomes of this session. The first one is that you can understand the meaning of population in your research study. The second one is that you can understand the meaning of sampling in your research study. As you know, that research problem plays an important role for any research project. A research problem usually addresses who and what. Who represents the individuals involved in the study, and what represents the things or behavior of the study. The terms who and what basically define the data collection, data analysis, and interpretation of the data. Data collection, data analysis, and especially the interpretation of data relate to the population of a study. Then, population plays a significant role in any type of research project. For an example, imagine a sociologist wants to study attitudes toward climate change. The population could be all adults in the country, undergraduate students in Western Province, members of environmental organizations, or elected officials in urban areas. Then, you have an idea about the concept of population. Here there are four populations for the effort of investigating the attitudes towards climate change. When selecting a population of all adults in the country, the findings can be generalized only to the attitude of adults in the country. It can't be extended to the undergraduates in the Western Province or any other category. Therefore, determining a population for a research study is crucial and significant to the findings of the study. How to define the concept of population? There are different definitions for the concept of population in order to account for the different angles of different scholars. The definition given here means a full set of individuals, groups, institutions, behaviors, or other units that use to make generalizations of the findings. However, the set of individuals or groups or behaviors is to be determined based on the study's objectives, questions, and resource availability. Based on the above definition, you have an idea about the population of your research project. Now we want to discuss the key characteristics of a population. The first one of the key characteristics of a population is a clear boundary. It might be either geographical limits, demographic limits, institutional limits, behavioral limits. Geographical limits means the region or geographical area. As an example, like the Western Province, Colombo. Demographic limits may be either gender. As an example, male or female. University may be either University of Sri Jayawardenepura or Colombo. Behavior may be a behavior of voting people in the recent election. As another example, the deviant behavior of employees in the company. The second one is shared characteristics. Here, shared means the collectivities. As an example, members of the group share one or more traits relevant to the study. When defining traits, they may be either physical traits or behavioral traits. Behavioral traits may be opinions, general behaviors, or roles. The third one is stability or changing in nature of the population. Some populations are relatively stable during certain periods. As an example, experienced nurses in hospitals. However, there are some populations that are always changing. When characteristics or elements of a population are always changing, it is a challenge for the researcher to do the research project. In the field of research, different categorizations of the population can be seen. Now we will discuss several categorizations of the population of the research field for your better understanding. The first one is the target population and accessible population. The target population is a population defined broadly. It means the entire group or the population. It is the ideal group for answering the research objective or questions. As an example, in a study about college students' mental health, the target population might be all undergraduate students enrolled in Sri Lankan universities. The target population is large and difficult to access because of time availability, cost factors, or geographical constraints. Accessible population. It is a part of the target population. The researcher has the ability to access the population. An alternative term for accessible population is study population. As an example, if a researcher is based at one university, the accessible population might be students currently enrolled at that university. Your sampling is drawn from the accessible population. Using an accessible population, you can draw your sample, and sample findings can be extended to the generalization of the target population. Another classification of the term population is finite population and infinite population. Finite population means that the population has a clear boundary. It is countable through the numbers of elements in the population. For example, undergraduates in the HRM field in Sri Lanka. As you are aware, the number of HRM undergraduates can be counted, therefore, the population is clear. Infinite population is the opposite meaning of finite population. It is difficult to define and impossible to count the elements of the population. Population may be difficult to define because of its largeness or frequently changing nature of its elements. As an example, an online platform for employee recruitment. Another categorization of the concept of population is homogeneous versus heterogeneous. Homogeneous population means that all elements in the population are similar in nature. Therefore, doing research is easy and findings can be clearly generalized. As an example, patients at a single medical clinic may have similar health conditions, making them a homogeneous population. Heterogeneous population is the secondary one of this classification. Characteristics of its elements are not similar. Therefore, there is a wide variety of diverse characteristics. Depending on its nature, the researcher has to select a large sample for getting the best result. Now we have to think about the practical aspect of the concept of population in your research. When we are going to define or determine a population, we have to think about several factors. The first one is the time frame. Time frame define different times considering the population. One population in terms of time is the population that is currently visible or functional. When considering the population in terms of time, the second one is that the population is based on past periods. For example, if you are going to do research about the Easter bomb attack, then you have to select the population from the past period of time, not the currently available. However, it depends on your study objective. In some cases you have to consider the population over a specific period. For example, if you are going to search for something during 2010 to 2020, then there is a time period. The second factor is that when you are going to select the proper population, you have to consider the geographical area or the region. Sometimes your study may cover the entire county or a specific province. It also depends on your topic. The third factor is inclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria means the specific characteristics relevant to the research objective and questions. For example, when searching for flexible work arrangements, the inclusion criteria may be the duration of work services and participation in flexible work practices like remote work or compressed workweeks. Exclusion criteria are the last factor to be considered. It means who are the disqualified individuals or elements. Now you have a sound idea about the concept of population. Now you can think that the population of your study is relatively large. Therefore, it is difficult to gather data from your population. Therefore, you need to select individuals or elements from the population to create your sample. Selecting entities from the population for your study is called a sample. A sample represents a small group of people or elements from the population, representing the natural quality of the population. Then, without gathering data from the entire population, you can make a conclusion about the population based on the sample findings. This is the graphical representation of the relationship between population and sample. Sample is part of the population, representing all qualities of the population. Then, you can easily generalize your findings based on the sample data. A sample can be defined as a group or part of a population including all qualities of the population. Therefore, it is a subset of the population. This is a big picture about population and sample. Population is the main source of deriving a sample. It is called a theoretical population. Theoretical population means the entire group that you want to give your conclusion. Based on the theoretical population, you can define the study population. It is the accessible population. Based on the study population, you can determine the sampling frame. The sampling frame illustrates the way you are accessing the accessible population. Following the sample frame, you can finally decide the sample, which is needed for your study. Now we have to discuss the sampling design. Through sampling design, you can get a good idea about the concept of sampling. Sampling design encompasses or determines how to select participants for your study. When you are going to select participants for your study as a sample, you have to follow the following steps or you have to consider the following components. The first one is population. It means the entire group of individuals are elements that are to be considered for your study. First, you have to clearly define your population. It is to be done according to your research objective. Secondly, you have to think about the sampling frame. Sampling frame means the list or database you are going to draw your sample from. Good sampling frames lead to all members of the population are considered. It is to avoid the bias. Thirdly, it is to be considered about the sampling method. Sampling method means how to choose the principles from the population. There are mainly two approaches to choose participants from the population as a sample. One approach is probability sampling. In this method, all elements have an equal chance to be a part of the sample. There are different sampling methods. The second approach is non-probability sampling. In this method there is no equal chance for all elements to be a part of a sample. The fourth element or component of sampling design is sample size. The number of elements selected for the sample. There is a statistically developed amount of the sample considering the total number of the population. The fifth element is sampling procedure. It implies how to select or the steps that have to be used for deriving the sample. Now we have to give our concentration for the sampling method. As I explained before, there are two approaches. The first approach is the probability sampling method. This approach is based on probability theory. Every element of the population has an equal chance to be a part of the sample. Then, there is no bias in this method to being a part of the sample from the population. Simple random sampling is one popular method under the probability sampling method. In this method, each element has an equal chance to be a part of the sample. Therefore, selecting the elements depends on a random method. When we assumed that there were 500 employees in a company and wanted to select 100 among them as a sample, you could use a computer application to select the sample. In another way, you can write the names of employees and put all the name cards into a pot or a container. Then, put your hand into the container and select one employee. In this way, you can select 100 employees. This method is like a raffle draw. This picture illustrates the simple random sampling method. Red circles are the sample elements you select from the population for your study. Systematic random sampling is the second method. In this method, researchers choose elements at equal intervals from the population. The approach to selecting the sample is to pick a starting point and then pick respondents at a predefined sample interval. Sample interval is important in this method. All employees of the company can be given numbers assigned to them in alphabetical order of their names. Depending on the size of the population, numbers can be selected by the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, and so on. This is the formal method of selecting a sample from the systematic sampling method. In a practical situation, one can even stay on a busy street and decide to interview people in a similar manner, approaching one person in every 10 or 20 or 30, and so on. Any other random formula can also be used to the same effect, as long as the participants are chosen with the same system, without any bias. Stratified random sampling. In this method, the population is divided into subpopulations that are based on special features. Dividing a population into subpopulations is called strata. It should be based on relevant features such as gender, race category, or income group. Considering the population and the sample size you decided to gather data from, you have to select events proportionately from each subpopulation. As an example, the company has 800 female and 200 male employees. Then, the total is 1,000. If you need 100 samples from the population, you have to consider the ratio of male and female. The ratio of female to male is 800 to 200. Or, in other words, 8:2. Now you have to select 100 samples from the population using the ratio of 8 to 2 female and male, respectively. How to do it? 800 female employees are divided by the total number of employees of 1,000 and multiplied by the sample size of 100. The result is 80 females. 200 male employees are divided by the total employees of 1,000 and multiplied by the sample size of 100. The result is 20 males. 80 females and 20 males can be selected from using the simple random sampling method or the systematic random sampling method. The fourth method under probability sampling is the cluster sampling. This method also involves dividing the population into subgroups. Here the special thing is that each subgroup has similar features. Under the stratified sampling method, you select events from each subgroup. However, under the cluster sampling method, you have to select several subgroups first. Secondly, you have to gather the data from all elements of selected subgroups. The best way is to collect data from all elements in the selected subgroups. However, if the subgroup is too large, then you can use a simple random sampling or systematic random sampling method to gather the data from each subgroup. This method is good when the population is large and scattered more. As an example, the company has offices in 10 cities across the country, all with roughly the same number of employees in similar roles. You don't have the capacity to travel to every office to collect your data, so you use random sampling to select 3 offices. These are your clusters. According to this picture, there are 9 clusters representing the target population. First, you have to select a few clusters. For example, in this picture, clusters 3, 4, and 8 were selected to gather the data. Then you can gather the data from the selected clusters. The second approach of the sampling is non-probability sampling. This approach is not based on probability, and as a result of non-probability, there is no equal chance for all elements of the population to be a part of a sample. As a consequence, your findings derived from your sample are not good enough to conclude the population, or it is not able to generalize the sampling findings. Therefore, when you are using non-probability sampling for your research project, you have to select samples carefully. These methods of sampling are always fit with the research approaches like explorative and qualitative research. Hypothesis testing is not the aim of these sampling methods. Convenience sampling is one of the non-probability sampling methods. In this method, researchers gather data or select elements from their easy access. The researcher's convenience is the basis of this method. Reliability and validity of the findings through this method are questionable. Judgmental sampling. This method is highly based on the judgment of the researcher. Alternative terms for judgmental sampling are purposive sampling, selective sampling, and subjective sampling. If the researcher has prior knowledge regarding the objective of the study, then the researcher can select a good fit sample for his or her study using judgments of the elements. Snowball sampling is another method under non-probability sampling. This method is good when traits of the population are difficult to find. The alternative name of this method is chain referral. If the researcher feels that access to the population is difficult due to privacy reasons or mistrust about the researcher, then this method is the best way of gathering data from that kind of population. The main way of gathering data under this method is that researchers find individuals and, through them, access the population. In here, the individual who is known by the researcher plays a significant role in facilitating the gathering of data. Quota sampling. Through the quota sampling method, researcher tries to access adequately representative samples from the population through specific subgroups. Using predetermined traits like age, gender, and occupation, a researcher has the ability to create a sample. Now you have a good idea about the concepts of population and sampling. In addition, you have to think about the population and sample of your research project. Here, I want to emphasize a special aspect about the application of the concept of population and sampling in your research. The thing is that the concepts of population and sample are not just two concepts used in the process of the research project. The concepts of population and sample are two important concepts that have to be represented or incorporated in your research title. Without the population and sample in your research title, any use of your research project may make it seem that your research project is a broader one. Therefore, you have to incorporate the population and sample in the title of your research. There are two examples. The first example is perceptions of population regarding topic, a study of sample. It is clear that without the population and sample, the research study becomes meaningless. The second example is the impact of intervention on outcome in population evidence from a sample study. This is a guideline you can use to calculate the sample size from the population. For an example, if your population is 10 elements, you have to select all elements as a sample. If your population size is 100, then you have to select at least 80 elements from your population as a sample. If your sample size is 1000, then you have to create a sample with 278 elements. Thank you for listening to me.